It's as simple as fear, as disturbing as hate. It's as fragile as humility. It's the way that we deal with what we truly feel about everything we see. Rally around a cage or act your age. Like age-old messages scratched forever in a prison wall. We know what we're capable of, but don't seem to care at all. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I have a confession to make. I never saw Beau is Afraid. I know, and I was a big fan of writer-director Ari Aster's films before that, those of course being Hereditary and Midsommar. I don't know quite what it was, because especially with so many of the filmmakers who made their bones in the mid to late 2010s with this sort of explosion in borderline art house genre movies, the so-called elevated horror cycle, whether it's Trey Edward Schultz or David Robert Mitchell or more recently Rose Glass, I am usually very excited to see any new breed of filmmakers who cut their teeth on low-budget genre cinema. I'm usually very excited to see them trying new things and expanding their dramatic horizons and maybe even taking big stylistic risks. As would have been the case when Aster decided to take the smash hits that both Hereditary and to a lesser extent Midsommar had been for top-line indie distributor A24 and parlay that into this mid-budget 3-hour epic surrealist black comic character study starring Joaquin Phoenix. But I'm gonna be honest, in the build-up to its release, I just didn't see very much in the publicity or even in the pretty divisive reception that the film received, not so much from mainstream critics as it did from the cohort of what I like to call the movie reactors, this just as new cohort of movie buffs who had largely been inaugurated into the following of American independent cinema at all, largely through the early genre movies of guys like Aster, only to be sort of sandbagged by this much more ambitious non-genre project. There just wasn't a lot there to pique my interest in keeping up with Aster, especially when it was being released in the springtime of 2023, where I'll be even more candid, by that point I was already pretty over-inundated by excitement for other established filmmakers taking their own creative risks as well as fresher faces in terms of independent writers and directors, many but not all of whom were taking less headline-catching routes of just making the sorts of challenging, dramatic works that, I'll be even more honest, I tend to prefer to the whole elevated horror cycle anyway. But I can't deny that even having not kept pace with Aster, I was nonetheless very keen on seeing his latest project, Eddington, in which he rejoined star Joaquin Phoenix to render this black comic neo-western of sorts that is a recent period piece set in May 2020 in the titular mid-sized town of Eddington, New Mexico. I managed to keep myself relatively blind to details regarding the plot of this film, which does use as part of its backdrop the early response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the nationwide protests following the police murder of George Perry Floyd Jr. in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But insofar as a project like that, especially from a filmmaker like Aster, who, even as he branches out in terms of genre experimentation and genre blending, if he has managed to maintain one signature as a writer-director, it is with his fixation on psychological extremes and the sort of snowball effect that can occur when individuals or groups, even otherwise normal people who are already under considerable stress or pressure or grieving a tragedy, are pushed further and further down dark rabbit holes that inevitably leads to these chaotic outbursts and these spectacular, semi-surreal set pieces in which it's almost as though the insanity itself establishes a new normal. Just that setup for Eddington puts Astor in advantageous dramatic territory for him, even as he ostensibly attempts to present a heightened and satirical version of what we should all be able to recognize about both the responses or lack thereof to COVID-19, as well as the Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality. Which is to say that Astor seems very clearly interested in taking what was previously only the private or nuclear psychological focus of Hereditary and Midsommar and expanding outward into the social realm, where we seem to be living in the context of a world where something as simple as a novel virus requiring extraordinary measures to prevent its spread, or the completely predictable and largely peaceful responses to a high-profile state killing of a human being, these things do not merely expose political schisms in terms of simply being about policy disagreements or whatever. They have a tendency with each and every one of these high-profile events. They have a way of exposing how many of us are, in fact, already so deep down a rabbit hole in which completely bog standard public health measures turn into the specters of some authoritarian conspiracy, or that private citizens protesting something as horrible but nonetheless as mundane in the United States as police brutality become caricaturized as anti-white extremists or something. Look, we've all been through what Astor's film is heightening and satirizing, where regardless of whether or not you understand the inherent absurdity or even madness of how so many of us internalized and collectively responded to these events, how they painted them in increasingly paranoid and violent ways in their own psyches. When we take a step back, it becomes completely predictable to see how we get to that sort of point, which is to say that in a world in which almost everybody spends so much time going down the rabbit holes of their own neurotic fixations, which things like social media and the internet directly feed into and exacerbate by algorithmically only recommending us things that keep us online and getting us even more excited for engagement with that exact sort of downward spiraling insulated fantasy play. Even as we ourselves are watching it and being able to see these middle American conservatives being convinced that the Antifa super soldier cells are going to be coming to an Eddington near you, if we take even the slightest step back, it does begin to look like we can only recognize these things or perceive them through the veil of narcissism with regards to minor differences, which I think in this satirical recent period piece, Astor actually dramatizes really effectively. Joaquin Phoenix portrays Joe Cross, the sheriff of the town of Eddington. He lives with his much younger craft artist wife Louise, played by Emma Stone, and since the COVID-19 lockdown has been forced to share their home with Dawn, Louise's super online evangelistic conspiracist mother, played by Deidre O'Connell. Dawn is constantly insisting that her daughter read all the materials and watch all the conspiracy content she does, and even breaks the passcode on Louise's phone and tablet to make sure she's consuming them just like she is. Joe thinks this stuff is all ridiculous, but it's clear that besides the fact that his relationship with his wife is already quite estranged and lacking in much in the way of real intimacy, that if she wasn't already going down the rabbit hole long before COVID-19 turned this temporary boarding situation to an indefinite one, Louise is nonetheless beginning to become convinced, not necessarily even by her mother, but by something in this media diet she is being force-fed. But before you get too sympathetic for Joe, old good-hearted Joe who just wants to do his job and do the right thing by his wife and even her mother who he can't stand, good old Joe Cross, always thinking of others before himself, before you start being too sympathetic to him, the way we are introduced to Joe Cross is by his just sitting in his police truck at night with nothing much going on between the town of Eddington and the sovereign tribal land which it borders. And so he's just sitting in his truck and watching his phone, and what he's watching is a YouTube video titled 5 Ways to Get Your Partner Who Doesn't Want Children to Have One. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about in terms of how effortlessly Astor seems to have transcended the bonds of making, again, largely private and nuclear studies in psychological extremes and people getting lost down the rabbit hole of their own obsessions and neuroses, and reframes it through the infinitely refracted social lenses of our hyper-mediated internet age. We may share Joe's chagrin about his mother-in-law and what effect she's having on her daughter, his wife, but Joe himself is also just kind of letting this shit happen under his own roof because he himself is also just complacently disappearing down his own rabbit hole. So it should probably come as no surprise when this flimsy, complacent, passive, impotent mid-sized town sheriff who, if I had to summarize his attributes, like, could you imagine if someone had the paranoid tendencies of Dale Gribble, but combined with the masochistic tendencies of Bill Dauterive? Joe is the sort of classic archetype of an old middle American white guy who, at a surface level, at once embodies so many patriotic standards and cliches. He's the top protector of his community, he's the old-fashioned Western sheriff, he's got the hot younger wife, he loves his guns, and yet he's also just kind of a complacent, phone-addicted, people-pleasing pussy who just doesn't want to wear a mask because, well, he says it's because he has asthma, but come on. And that really does lay the groundwork for the inciting conflict of the film. Joe, the emasculated Western man who just can't stand to see all of this COVID-19 lockdown policies and how they're negatively affecting people because these businesses have to operate at half capacity, even though everybody still has to shop there, so any money they're losing is going to come from people losing their jobs and not receiving income, not the regulations themselves. That old people like him and his MAGA buddy who owns an antique shop that sells lawn jockeys in the window, they just can't breathe en masse, and you're telling that person that they can't shop for their groceries even though there is no COVID in Eddington, so we don't need these things. Why is everybody so divided? Why is everybody so mean to each other now? And so Joe decides that he's gonna run for mayor, challenging the incumbent Ted Garcia, played by Pedro Pascal, who also a long time ago had an affair with Joe's wife. In other words, just as every character basically disappears further and further down their respective rabbit holes, Astor is not getting over complex or dimensional in terms of what he frames as a driving motivation for so many of these characters, which is not so much just psychological extremes, but like psychosexual obsessions. Joe isn't simply feeling emasculated, he feels as though he has been thoroughly unmanned, and so Eddington basically turns into an ever-escalating series of chaotic and, it must be said, excellently directed satirical set pieces in which it isn't even just Joe. There's even a subplot about 3 local high school seniors and potentially one of the most daring and likely to be controversial decisions Astor chooses to make is with this subplot about these 3 teenagers. 2 boys and 1 girl, and the triangle of unrequited love and toxic masculine chauvinism that transpires against the backdrop of the isolated Black Lives Matter protests. I really do think this is a likely area of Astor's film that is going to be misinterpreted, or rather, I think a lot of terminally online people are going to absolutely prove Astor's point about the narcissism with regards to minor differences in terms of the rabbit holes we're getting progressively lost down. I think a lot of these people are going to see this subplot about, like, a white high schooler played by Cameron Mann who fakes at being a race-critical leftist in order to get in the good graces of a pretty white girl, social justice warrior. She's played by Amelie Hoferl, only for her to be stolen out from under him by this guy's best friend, played by Matt Gomez Hidaka, who also happens to be the son of Ted Garcia, Pascal's mayor character. Look, it's not like people aren't going to have a point about this being a tired cliche about young white hipsters only being into social justice for credibility, and in the case of young men, the pussy. But I'm gonna be honest, you're probably not going to find a lot of real social justice activists, especially women and women of color, who are going to disagree with you on that. There is a very big difference between supporting a movement, which is good, and being a part of that movement, which only gets the funnier, and you realize that Aster isn't just taking potshots at these fake Antifa teenagers, because he literally has Hofurl just ever so severely explaining just that concept to man. But I also frankly think it says something that we're so used to seeing men and boys portrayed as the phony leftists who are just trying to get pussy. I think it's actually progress of a sort that I don't want to give it away, but please, in a weird way, we need more representation for characters like Hofurl, and I don't want to say the two words that are in my head because I don't want to give it away. Skip ahead a few seconds if you don't want me to give it away, because the two words I'm thinking of, they rhyme with "oh, honey." But I also need to not be so glib and stress that, yes, Aster does not reserve his satire only for right-wing rabbit holes of conspiracism. He also satirizes the vanguard of questionably committed social justice leftism that exploded around the Black Lives Matter protest. But there are clearly huge differences that he is outlining through the drama that undergirds all that glib humor. Aster satirizes these characters in terms of their complacency and hypocrisy, but for every shot that he takes at young, horny white leftists, he basically just takes a Gatling gun and just starts spraying not only the conspiratorial dissent of far-right conservatives, but also just establishment liberals in general, like Pascal's mayor Ted Garcia. And insofar as Eddington does, to a certain degree, become a series of ever-escalating absurdist set pieces, all organized around the kind of deleterious psychological dissent of Sheriff Joe Cross. To wit, I think my major criticism of Eddington wouldn't even be a political one, it would be a dramatic one. I think, like a lot of filmmakers of Aster's cohort who made their bones by creating these elevated, more psychologically oriented genre films, I think he's kind of just showing his true colors here in terms of sharing a similar crutch to his fellow travelers in elevated genre films, including many whose work I much respect and like in technical terms, which is at a certain point, at a certain critical juncture where it's time for a character to make a really extreme turn, it just doesn't feel as plausible and motivated as it should be from a psychological perspective, and really feels more like a term that I'm feeling more comfortable in applying to filmmakers like Aster, and especially the filmmakers who rip him and his contemporaries off without even a trace of the same technical finesse. I wouldn't call it psychological as much as pseudo-logical. I had a very similar experience with the revenge thriller Bring Them Down from earlier this year, where it just seems too transparent that Aster's desire to satirize as much as possible and to keep his film on this trajectory of exciting escalation for his audience means that we dispense with any sense at a certain point that especially how our starring role, Sheriff Joe Cross, behaves in the latter half of the film, especially a hard character turn that he takes in terms of his extreme dissent, that it feels motivated or earned at all and isn't, again, not a psychological turn, but a pseudo-logical turn. You can understand schematically how this is supposed to have worked, how this turn was supposed to have at once been shocking, but also, as we look back, consistent. Except it just doesn't feel that way, and at a certain point, Eddington does become more of a black comic thrill ride than a genuinely transgressive examination of the psychology of somebody lost down their own private rabbit holes. But, on the one hand, again, on their own, these ever-escalating set pieces are directed excellently. Even if a certain hard twist in the plot doesn't feel natural, you very quickly forget it not just because Aster is so good at organizing spectacles of utter chaos, but honestly because the rest of the ensemble is so credibly fleshed out and engaging on their own that you kind of dispense with being too harsh on the painting of Joe Cross, who really should be seen, I think, as more of a cipher than as a character. Which sort of brings me back to my point about what and how far Aster chooses to go in terms of his socio-political satire here, because even if a major theme of the film is that we are all, on the one hand, contributing to each other's descents into madness by feeding each other and accepting on complacent trust different mad obsessions pruned from the internet, only to look on from our own prisons and have the nerve to say about someone else, that man has really lost the plot. That is a major theme of the film, and compelling both as a drama and black comedy in terms of how Aster executes it, and how ably the ensemble rises to the occasion of portraying these characters who, even apart from Joe Cross, are both credible archetypes of real people, but also ciphers of a certain type of personality. But the point that Aster ultimately brings us to as the spectacle of absurdity ramps up and up and up is that, yes, these teenage phony leftists are cringy, but police brutality is real. The disrespect for tribal sovereignty is real, and in fact, Joe Cross disrespects tribal sovereignty throughout the movie, while at the same time just doing some befuddled, nice guy shtick of like, yeah, fine, I respect you, whatever, I don't know why you're so mad about it, I don't know why you're being so mean. Establishment liberals exploiting fears of socioeconomic decline in order to get their voters to either sign off on or turn a blind eye to, say, them blowing a whole bunch of public money on a massive new AI data center that's not going to provide much in terms of stable jobs or economic uplift for the community, as it is going to totally the environment, that's real. Can we at least give Aster his credit for making a recent period drama that nonetheless still turned out to be this prescient? I know that these AI data centers being an absolute disaster in terms of both local public health and global climate change aren't new in certain circles, but like, it was literally only just a couple weeks ago that we were finally getting the story blown on how one of Elon Musk's Colossus data centers in Memphis, Tennessee, is just pumping nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere. You know what's not real? A global elite conspiracy of pedophile Satan worshippers to either manufacture a virus or fake a pandemic or control people with nanobots in the mRNA vaccines, or even just Antifa super soldiers coming to commit massive terrorist attacks in a small town near you. That is not real. It's not happening. It should be very obvious to anyone when Aster is merely satirizing just basic flaws and foibles in human nature, and when he's satirizing the obvious discrepancies between the fears that are established and credible and ones that somebody only got into yesterday by spending too much time on Facebook during lockdown. Eddington is satirizing our narcissism with regards to minor differences, but it's not a nihilistic film. It has a very clear moral compass as far as what sort of extreme material realities are worth even some cringy extreme language or action, and what is simply an extreme psychological and, again, in many cases, a genuinely maladaptive psychosexual fantasy. That's the moral of the movie. Basically, lots of us have problems, but a lot of us also only have problems. And the thing about problems is that because they are material, they can be solved, or at least reformed or addressed collectively. Problems, on the other hand, there's no solution for them, and that's even kind of the point. That's what makes these rabbit holes so alluring. You don't have to ask for help. You don't have to depend upon someone who knows better than you do. You don't have to make a sacrifice in terms of the best interests of others. You just get to think about yourself, and because there is no solution, your problems keep feeding in on themselves and just get worse and worse and worse. If I wanted to be snarky, and to be clear, only as snarky as possible in a way as to say that I'm trying to not get lost down my own cinematic rabbit hole. I'm trying to balance different ways I could understand of liking or dismissing Astor's new film. If I wanted to be snarky, I might say that Eddington is kind of like, from a political and storytelling perspective, especially when it comes to Joe Cross as this cipher at the center of the story, it's basically just a long live-action South Park episode, albeit one of those fun standalone ones with Sergeant Harrison Yates. But if I'm being honest, I didn't realize how much I wouldn't just love, but would have kind of needed a really long live-action adaptation of South Park, especially one with such well-directed set pieces, with such an adventurous and exciting, if not always quite so nerve-wracking momentum, and with such a strong dramatic cast who inhabit their respective roles enough that it wasn't really like until 24 hours later that I realized that they were basically playing real-life cartoon characters. This is also the perfect movie for anyone who is upset that the Coen brothers won't be collaborating on their own satirical neo-western anytime soon. It's gonna scratch that itch. It's also a perfect movie for people like me who hated Three Billboards. That's my highest snarky praise of Eddington, actually, that this is basically like Three Billboards, but it wasn't made by some glib, self-hating Mick who couldn't possibly have fewer insights about the American psyche, and if it was actually good. I'm giving Eddington an enthusiastic 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm signing off. Thank you so much for sticking out this whole video. Don't be a stranger to the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.